Hello, everyone. This is Jim Hughes with AFIO Now. We are a program of interviews with former U.S. intelligence officers and those who write about them. Today, I have a very interesting guest. His name is Dr. Andrew Hammond. He is the current historian and curator for the International Spy Museum. He served in the Royal Air Force, was on secondment to both the British Army and the Royal Navy. He's held positions teaching on both sides of the Atlantic. He held fellowships at the British Library. He now hosts a podcast for the International Spy Museum called Spycast. And he has a brand new book coming out sometime later in the year called Struggles for Freedom. Andrew, welcome to AFIO Now.
Thank you very much, Jim. It's a pleasure to join you, sir.
Andrew, you have a very interesting background. How did you get involved in intelligence?
I mean, I think I've always found it fascinating. I remember as a young boy, I got probably like a lot of people, I got a book out of the public library on, tradecraft basically. And I remember coming across this technique where I would get a pencil and I would make a mark underneath a drawer and I would leave the drawer open a little bit so that I could tell if my mother was raking through my drawers. So there's that part of it. But then much later on, as you said, I was in the Royal Air Force and I was in a photographic intelligence unit when 9/11 happened. And I think that led me to, I felt like an actor in a play, but I didn't really understand the plot. And ever since then, in one way or another, I've been trying to understand the plot. But that period made me interested in the broader dynamics within which intelligence plays out, because it's an inherently international game. And I think that it also just made me thinking about imagery intelligence and then thinking about all the other platforms that are used to bring in information, whether it be human beings, bugs, cameras, satellites, whatever. So there's two parts there. There's the reading too many books as a kid and on the subject, and then there's a little bit of real world experience.
Andrew, your book starts off in 1979 in the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and deals in large part with Operation Cyclone, the CIA support to the Mujahideen. Tell our viewers a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So I know that this is something that many of the listeners or viewers will know about, but I just find it really, really, really interesting. In the year 1979, just starting from there. So 1979, if you think about the geopolitics of the Cold War, and this is something I've went through in many presidential libraries, many congressional papers, spoke about in many interviews, the northern tier and the Cold War chessboard. So we're talking about Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. So let's think about 1979 and the US position in that area. So the hostage crisis obviously happens in 1979, begins then. The US Embassy in Islamabad is burned to the ground in the year. And the American ambassador in Kabul in Afghanistan is killed that year, Adolphus Stubbs. And then later on in that year, the Soviets invade Afghanistan, which, Carter goes on to describe as the greatest threat to the peace since the Second World War. So I think it's this monumental year for the West, for the Cold War, for American foreign policy, and of course for the CIA, because to me this comes along at such an interesting time. You've had the Church and Pike committees in 75. The American global position in the 70s seems much less assured. There's reverses in Vietnam, Africa, the Horn of Africa, South Asia. And, some people, even people like Kissinger are talking about, has the historical correlation of forces shifted decisively against the United States. So it comes along at an interesting time when America's a little bit on the back foot, when the CIA is a little bit on the back foot. Church and Pike, Rockefeller, you've got Stansfield Turner, someone that seems being out of touch. There's changes within the agency. He wants to shift it towards technical intelligence. And then you have this pivot in 1979. And then on the back of that, you have Reagan, Casey. You have a very different approach to intelligence. You have a very different approach to covert action. But I think that another thing that I find interesting is I've traced a lot of the roots of the things that they attribute to Reagan. The genesis of them comes in the Carter era. The narrative that gets attached to the Soviet-Afghan War starts in the Carter era. You can go through documents where Brzezinski and Carter are talking about, do we call them insurgents, rebels, freedom fighters, whatever, but also the covert action. So it goes from non-lethal aid to lethal aid. And then because of the Soviet invasion, the Carter administration becomes more hardline. Brzezinski gets the upper hand. Vance resigns in 1980. So I think that there's just a really interesting shift that takes place. And I think that the CIA, Afghanistan, and Operation Cyclone are just really, really fascinating because of when they happen and how they happen. And you see this pivot within world politics, within US foreign policy, and then also within the world of intelligence, because Carter comes in saying that he's going to, tame the CIA. And then you have Casey, who says he's going to unleash the CIA. So you see this pivot within the agency as well, which I think is really, really interesting.
Andrew, I think our audience would be very interested in knowing how you went about your research. What kind of archives were you able to access? What individuals were you able to interview that help you build the story?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that started off with a degree of naivete. I thought that it was going to be relatively easy, but it involved a lot of lateral thinking, a lot of thinking outside of the box. So I think that I started off with the presidential libraries. The stuff that was declassified at Reagan, at Carter, were quite important and quite helpful. And then after that, I started looking at congressional papers. So I looked at Gordon Humphrey's, Charlie Wilson's, a bunch of other people on the Hill that were involved in this particular covert action. Then I started looking at papers of people in the administration. And one of the set of papers that you're interested in, they may be most interested in, is I was at the Hoover Institute quite a lot. And I kept saying, when are the Casey papers getting released? When are the Casey papers getting released? And one day, and this is due to no skill or anything on my part, but I went there one day, a few months later, and said, almost expecting the same answer, the family's not signed off yet. I was like, have the Casey papers been released yet? And they said, we just opened them this morning. So I don't know if serendipity or whatever. So I went through Bill Casey's papers. They, of course, provide an incomplete picture. So I thought, just speak to people. And it started off speaking to people that were on the NSC, or people that were in the DOD, or people that were involved in the stingers. And then I'll give you one good example. I spoke to Charles Cogan, who's unfortunately passed away since I spoke to him. But he was the chief of the Near East and South Asia division, like yourself, Jim, between 79 and 84. And he was very gracious, very, very helpful. Of course, he wasn't especially forthcoming about the covert action, but he introduced me to other people, and then they introduced me to other people. And then before you knew it, I was speaking to people that were in Peshawar in 86, or people that were, in Islamabad or in Afghanistan, just as the covert action came to an end and so forth. So using all of them, I just try to I try to rub away as much parts of the hidden mosaic of the covert action as I could. And then, of course, there's been excellent stuff that's came out, like Steve Coll's book, Ghost Wars, Bruce Rydell's book, I think it's called What We Won. I've not read it for a few years. And then also some of the stuff that's been done in the Russian archives. People like Sir Roderick Braithwaite, the last British ambassador to the Soviet Union, his book Afghansy looks at that goes through the Soviet archives and looks at the Soviet experience in Afghanistan. So you do get a picture. And of course, it's one of those things, if you really want to get as much of a full picture as you can, you have to study something that happened probably 200 years ago. But I'm more interested in modern stuff. So this is the pitfalls and challenges of doing intelligence history, and especially modern intelligence history.
It's great to hear Chuck Cogan's name. He was a great CIA officer and actually one of my bosses, of course, and was a fellow and taught at Harvard for a number of years after he retired from the government. Were you able to interview any of the other agency officers involved in the program whose names you can mention?
Yeah, I interviewed Frank Anderson, who's also sadly passed away. And again, I've read about Frank, and I only had a 1 hour conversation. So I'm not saying that I've captured the essence of him. And I'm sure many people that listen to this or watch it will know him much better than me. But I found him such an interesting figure because he was classy. He was to the point. He was also quite colourful. One of the phrases that I remember is he said, Gulbuddin's a mother, and you can quote me on that. But then I also know that alongside that hard charging part of him, he was known as a diplomat, as someone that could, that wasn't just a blunt instrument, someone that knew that intelligence had a role to play in alleviating or mitigating or managing conflict and tension within the international system. So I really, really enjoyed speaking to him. And then, of course, it was quite interesting speaking to different people that were the chief of the Near East and South Asia division, because you get different generational insights, different views, different time periods, and Chuck and Frank were quite different. So those were two ones that stick out. And another one that sticks out actually was Vince Canestraro. I interviewed him by phone, spoke to him a couple of times, and he was really, really interesting because he was just so thoughtful. So this was during the period of the war, one of the high points of the war, the latest war in Afghanistan. And he was saying, he was just talking about ripples in the pond of time and how it's so interesting for him, who was on the NSC, who was involved in this program, to see the after effects, the second and third order effects cascading down throughout history. So I just found him really, really thoughtful. And then he was also speaking about terrorism during the 1980s, Lebanon, Libya, and then coming up to 9/11. So he was also looking at it through the lens of the evolution of the counterterrorism and the evolution of the CIA and its relationship to counterterrorism. So just so many fascinating people.
Well, it's great to hear both of those gentlemen's names as well. I served with them both. Frank was a quintessential Near East Division officer and Arabist, and actually one of my mentors. Vince and I actually served together. There were many, many important aspects of the Afghan program. In your view, what was the turning point? What really caused things to start changing in Afghanistan for the Mujahideen?
I think this is not always the most satisfying answer for people, because they want to look at one specific thing and say this was the drop that made the cup run over. But to get to the drop that makes the cup run over, all the other drops have to come before it. So I think that it's the covert action as a totality. I don't think it was just the introduction of the stingers. Some of the work that's been done in the Soviet archives, has suggested that the decision to withdraw was made before the stingers were introduced to the battlefield. So that's another interesting historical question. Were the pushing on an open door, or did it just carry it over the finish line? There's all kinds of analogies that we can use, but I think that the stingers were important. And even, for example, in a morale dimension, it's quite interesting to just see photographs of these Afghan fighters wearing their traditional clothing with this state-of-the-art piece of weaponry that's bringing down really advanced Soviet helicopters. So I think that for me, the stingers are interesting and important, but I think that it's the whole thing that made the difference. It's the beginning, it's the non-lethal aid, then it's the lethal aid, and then it's the program getting continually ratcheted up. And that's a whole interesting process in and of itself. Different people within the agency, some are a bit more cautious, some are a bit more hard charging, even within the administration as well. Yeah, I think that for me, it's the whole covert action. That's where I would lay it. I think it would be unfair to say, here's this one moment where everything changed, because that one moment where everything changed was as a result of everything else that came before it. So I would say that it was the whole covert action that made the difference.
Yeah, and an interesting but probably little known factoid is that the agency had to introduce mules into Afghanistan because the terrain was so rough. They really couldn't deliver all of the equipment to the endpoint using trucks. And so they imported a bunch of mules to help deliver the equipment all the way, into that very rough mountainous terrain. I told you off camera that in 1986, a group of us were shown an early homemade video recording of the very early downing of a Russian helicopter in Afghanistan using a Stinger. We've seen many photos like that today, but in 1986, that was very new and frankly jaw-dropping for us to see that for the first time.
I can't even imagine what it was like. It must have been exhilarating, and also just, yeah, it must just have been such a fascinating thing, because I find this so interesting. I was only a young boy at the time, but I remember watching this, news about the Soviet-Afghan War on the TV screen, and I have to say that even as a young boy, it felt great to feel like the Soviets were just getting it socked to them by somebody. I think that for me, that was interesting. And just when you were talking there, it reminded me of when I went to look through Charlie Wilson's papers, and there's a lot in there about the mules that get sent to Afghanistan and his role in all of that. There's pictures of, Charlie being Charlie and, the mules.
I think another fairly significant factor was that the US and Saudi Arabia doubled their support for the program in about 1985. And it was actually my privilege to interpret for Director Casey and King Fahd during a key conversation in the spring of 1985, when they agreed to each side doubling their support for the program. It was quite an interesting session. Director Casey, God bless him, was hard to understand. And actually, I had better luck understanding Fahd sometimes than I did Casey. And so in anticipation of this meeting, I talked Director Casey's chief of staff into letting me sit in on the prep session so I could hear Director Casey speak and have some idea what the content of the conversation was going to be like. And I'll never forget, his first line was, "Gaddafi is on a roll." Well, of course, that's very idiomatic English and doesn't really translate very easily into Arabic. But at least I had kind of 24 hours to think about it and know what I was going to say in Arabic. Fahd wanted the session where he agreed to doubling the support to be only 8 eyes, only 4 people. And so it was Casey, myself, Fahd, and a note taker. And Fahd specifically wanted an American to be the interpreter. And so we got through that session. He agreed, and then a larger group of people joined us for the rest of the session, which was held in the Ambassador Prince Bandar's residence there in Northern Virginia. But it was
Wow.
quite a historic session, and I actually got a pat on the knee by King Fahd after it was over.
Wow. We need to speak some more about this, Jim. That's really, really fascinating, because that's going back to what made the difference. That time period is when you see the pendulum begin to swing, right? It's like 85, 86. That's when you see the pivot where it's, are we just arming these people for them to be killed, or then it becomes these people can drive the Soviets out. So I think that's a really interesting period, and it's so interesting you had that experience. I actually wrote a book chapter on Casey a few years back, and I just find him such an interesting figure again. And I remember, you'll have heard this one before, but the joke was that he didn't need a scrambler because he mumbled and the Soviets would never understand him.
He was sometimes hard to understand. But God bless Bill Casey. He was a tremendous director. He did a lot for the nation. He did a lot for the agency. He was a devout Catholic. He was a voracious reader. On the few times that I traveled with him, he was always going to Mass somewhere in the country that he visited. And he always wanted to go to a bookstore and collect literally an armload of books. I don't think he actually slept very much. I think he did a lot of reading on all kinds of topics during his off hours.
Yeah, really fascinating figure. I mean, even the course of his life, it's just so interesting what he'd done and the types of things that he was involved with. He was just a really, really fascinating director to me.
He was in the OSS, of course, and he was in charge of analysis in London up until D-Day. And then after D-Day, he actually became in charge of operations in occupied or newly liberated Europe. And he's actually written a book about it, which is quite good. And one of the interesting things was that guys who were being dropped behind the lines in occupied Europe were being overtaken by Patton's Third Army so quickly that they became pathfinders. They weren't intelligence collectors anymore. But he's written a very readable book about all of those events.
Yeah, really, really fascinating figure.
Andrew, what kind of conclusions do you draw when you look, beyond 1979 to 1985, when you look at 9/11, the so-called end of the Cold War and into the future? What kind of lessons learned do you draw?
I think lessons learned, one of them, I don't say this with any kind of joy, but one of them would be, if you just look at the Soviet-Afghan War and do a very basic study of it, it tells you the difficulty of fighting an insurgency that has a 1,500-mile border with a safe refuge that's ostensibly an ally, but that sometimes gets involved in all of the internal politics, which is exactly what we saw during the post-9/11 war in Afghanistan. For me, this is easy to say in hindsight, right? And I wasn't making these decisions, but to me, if you look at the Soviet-Afghan War and spend a bit of time studying it, you just immediately think that it has to be, if we go in, it has to be super limited, or there has to be a strategy not to replicate what the Soviets done. I think that's one of them. I think another one would be, it's so difficult to anticipate the second or third order effects of actions that you're taking in the present. So to go back to Vince Canestraro's point, the ripples in time. If you're involved in Operation Cyclone, you're not thinking about what's going to happen a generation from now. You're just thinking the US is on the back foot. There's an energy crisis. We seem to have a lack of leadership. The Soviets are on the move. They've really crossed the line here by invading this country, and we need to sock it to them and give them as much of a bloody nose as we can. So, and that's not just for intelligence officers. I think that's just for anybody that's involved in world politics. You can do what you can do in the moment, and then you're always going to suffer from the people that come along after you that have a different operating system in terms of their values and their culture and the context that they live in, and they're going to second guess what you had done previously. That doesn't mean to say that everybody always gets off with doing whatever they want to do, but I think as a historian, it just sensitized me to trying to get people to, just to think about how other human beings, whether that be intelligence officers or policymakers, encountered the world around them.
You know, I think one of the great strengths of CIA's Near East and South Asia division was that, at least during my generation, most of us were there for a 30 or 35-year career. Also, in addition to the basic operational training, we spent an awful lot of time on what we called language and area studies. And so we had not a large cadre, but a cadre of some really deep Middle East experts who had spent most of a lifetime living and working and studying in that area of the world. And I think we're in a much better position to kind of give whatever administration the long view on what was happening and what the impacts might be. One of the strengths and weaknesses of our own country is that we tend to do politics in 4-year cycles, and that doesn't tend to give you the chance to take the long view.
I think you're right, and I think that you could say the United States, but you could also say the democratic system of government, where there's a continual recalibration of political power every 4 or 5 years, which means that people think in those sorts of time frames. So I think that long view is really, really important. And thankfully, at various points in the system, I think that enough people come through. You know, it's a big country. There's lots of really wicked smart people here. There's lots of really great schools. And despite some of the vagaries of democracy or institutions, there does seem to be enough smart people that get into enough important positions that some of that context does get through. Not always, but I feel like, you know, just thinking about Brzezinski and Carter. I mean, Brzezinski's basically given Carter like here's the grand sweep of world politics and the role that the Soviets are playing. I mean, they're not just how is this going to play out and how is this going to play out in Iowa. They are thinking about the big picture.
Andrew, let me switch subjects on you just a little bit. You are the historian and curator at the International Spy Museum. I'm delighted to say that AFIO did its last symposium at the museum 2 days before the grand opening in 2019. And my family and I were actually privileged to attend the grand opening. It was a lot of fun. My kids really enjoyed it. What kind of things are you doing today? What would our viewers be interested in hearing about that's going on at the International Spy Museum these days?
Yeah, absolutely. And the last time we spoke, Jim, our founding executive director, Peter Ernest, was still with us. And that's another sad loss that's certainly been felt deeply around here. And I know that you knew him well. Some of the things that we're doing here, which are quite exciting. So since I came on board, I took over Spycast. And one of the things that I'm trying to do is to try to internationalize it a little bit more. So the United States, that's the majority of our listeners. That's going to be our core audience. You know, they are very, very important, and we're always going to cater to them. But as you know better than anybody, you know, American intelligence doesn't exist in a vacuum. It relies on people like yourself that know languages and cultures and histories of various parts of the world. So I'm trying to just bring a little bit of that to Spycast. So last year, I was really proud of getting a former head of India's research and analysis wing on. And we're going to have a head of hopefully a couple of other Asian countries on particularly soon. I don't want to say it yet because it's not in the bag, but I'm hoping to get them. So I want to try to just give Spycast listeners a picture of different things that are happening around the world. In terms of things that we've got going on right at this moment institutionally, We've got a pop-up exhibit on Operation Hake, so a US-Colombian operation to rescue hostages, including one of the current presidential candidates in Colombia, Cristina Betancourt. So that's taking place. We're going to be redesigning the George Washington Gallery. We have some really great stuff there. So there's lots of exciting things happening here. And I think that at the moment we're also trying to we're adjusting out of COVID, because you were at the opening, we were going gangbusters. COVID happened, we closed. All of the staff have been furloughed at some point. Things were extremely difficult. It was difficult to be in the museum business, but we're back now where there's a lot of life in the place. We are really passionate about our mission of trying to help the public understand intelligence and espionage, because it's just too important for the public not to have some understanding of it. So for me anyway, I'm a believer. Like, I believe in the mission, and that's what gets me up out of bed. I love trying to tell people about it. I love trying to educate them about it. I love getting them to think differently about it. So those are some of the things that I'm doing. And just briefly, for the podcast as well, I wrote an article a few years back on oral history and the CIA. So speaking to former intelligence officers. And one of the things that I'm trying to bring to the podcast is I'm trying to humanize intelligence officers, because to me, and the broader public, just from movies or the media, it's either, I don't know, there's a tendency to see them as very black or white, or to say that they're one thing or they're something else. But these are human beings that have, there's a variety of different textures to them, that have hopes and dreams like everybody else. And I mean, if you want to criticize them or US foreign policy or a covert action, go ahead, but at least understand a little bit more what you're talking about. That's my view. So I want to try to just humanize and put a face on this very misunderstood and much maligned world that is just extremely important.
Well, I sincerely hope, as a result of our joint efforts, that we can put a more human face on intelligence officers. Andrew, as I think you know, a segment of our viewership and listenership are students, both high school and college students, some of whom aspire to entering the U.S. intelligence community at some future date. You know that AFIO has an outreach program to academia, and I know the International Spy Museum does as well. Do you have anything that you'd like to say to students who might aspire to joining the intelligence community in the future?
Yeah, one of them I would say would be continue listening to AFIO, and also I would suggest Spycast, the Spy Museum's podcast. Recently, we've started putting up further resources, primary documents, other podcasts, documentaries. So just educate yourself. Don't be naive. Go in with as much knowledge as you can without, going through that process of being initiated and formally welcome to the fold. So educate yourself in that front. Also, I would say the first thing that you should probably do every morning is read the international pages of the Times or the Post or the Journal, or subscribe to The Economist, some quality news outlet, because it's an international game. Even what the FBI do here on American soil, they're chasing international people by and large. So it's a very international game. The more you know about the world, the more that you think about the world, the better. Think about something that you may want to specialize in, what really interests you. Is there a particular region? And that's not to say that, you want to be, that you have to commit your whole life to that. But I think to me, it's quite interesting if someone comes along and they say, you know what, I've just become really fascinated in Russia, and I've been reading Russian literature, and I've been reading about Russian history and watching Russian movies. That says to me that, that there's something about this person. So you want someone that's a mile wide, but you also want someone that can focus in on particular issues. It's like if you defend everything, you defend nothing, right? But if you defend one little part of the wall with everything you have, you're also defending nothing. So just think about that combination of breadth and depth. But I would definitely say get up to speed on international affairs, go to talks, read the newspapers, subscribe to The Economist or some other quality publication, and just educate yourself and arm yourself. If you're an analyst, the more that you know about that type of stuff, the better for being an analyst. And if you're a case officer, for certain, different parts of the world, hiding in plain sight, being attuned to the cultural mores, almost the music of a particular setting, whether that be, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, Nicaragua, whatever. The more that you can get a feel for that music of another culture and another context, then the better. So there's lots of different things that you can do, but continue to be inquisitive and continue to educate yourself.
Well, happily, because of our joint efforts and the efforts of others, there's just a lot more public information available to U.S. citizens and others about intelligence and the U.S. intelligence community. When I joined the agency over 50 years ago, there was very, very little public information available. And I'm happy to say that has really changed significantly in the intervening period. The book is called Struggles for Freedom, Afghanistan and U.S. Foreign Policy since 1979. It'll be coming out later this year. And I really want to thank Dr. Andrew Hammond and the International Spy Museum for an exceedingly interesting conversation.
Thank you so much, Jim. It's a pleasure to speak to you.